evening, everyone. Welcome to our event tonight, a conversation with Laura Kipnis on sexual paranoia, gender strife, cultural revolution, conversation on the state of our sexual culture. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm professor of religion and philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring our event tonight. The purpose of St. Olaf College's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and sustain free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event, very special thanks go to the staff of the Institute, Administrative Assistant Shannon Regier and Assistant Director Greg Seams. They are sine qua non, and I'm grateful for all they do in support of the Institute and the college. Thanks also to Molly Work and Carrie Vanderveen of Marketing and Communications, and Jeff O'Donnell, along with the Broadcast Media Services crew, for their contributions to our event tonight. Our guest speaker, Laura Kipnis, is a cultural critic and former video artist whose work focuses on, in her words, sexual politics, aesthetics, emotion, acting out, bad behavior, and various other crevices of the American psyche. As you can see, she has a lively imagination and a sense of humor.
Thank you.
She's a professor in the Department of Radio, TV, Film at Northwestern University and the author of 7 books, I would say all provocatively titled, including Men, Notes from an Ongoing Investigation, How to Become a Scandal, Against Love, a Polemic, The Female Thing, Dirt, Sex, Envy, Vulnerability, and most provocatively, I guess, Bound and Gagged, Pornography and the Politics of Fantasy in America. Her most recent book, and the most pertinent to our topic tonight, is entitled Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus. The book was published by HarperCollins in 2017. Laura Kipnis has also contributed essays and reviews to the New York Review of Books, Slate, Harper's, Playboy, the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, and Book Forum. Her essay, Sexual Paranoia Strikes Academe, originally published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, was eventually included in Jonathan Franzen's collection, The Best American Essays, 2016. That essay, along with a follow-up piece in the Chronicle entitled My Title IX Inquisition, and the book Unwanted Advances, have gotten a lot of attention. Laura Kipnis is now, as a consequence, a prominent and controversial voice for some, a notorious voice in current public discussions of sexual politics. She is certainly a distinguished voice, an extraordinarily engaging writer with an acerbic, ironic wit, a powerful and indeed courageous social commentator and critic. She has been willing to say things that she thinks are true, but are nonetheless exceedingly difficult to say, given the current social and political climate in America, particularly on matters sexual. Whatever one thinks of such matters or her viewpoint on them, one can only admire her guts and resolve, and for that reason, among others, we are pleased to have her with us tonight. Thank you, Laura Kipnis, for joining us this evening. And could you please offer a St. Olaf welcome?
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
You're welcome. To give our audience, Laura, some sense of how you can stir things up, I want to read the HarperCollins notice of your book, Unwanted Advances, a notice that appears on the front flap of the book jacket. And here it is. A committed feminist, Kipnis was surprised to find herself the object of a protest march by student activists at her university for writing an essay about sexual paranoia on campus. Next, she was brought up on Title IX complaints for creating a hostile environment. Defying confidentiality strictures, she wrote a whistleblowing essay about the ensuing 72-day investigation, which propelled her to the center of national debates over free speech, safe spaces, and the vast federal overreach of Title IX. In the process, she uncovered an astonishing netherworld of accused professors and students, campus witch hunts, rigged investigations, and Title IX officers run amok. Then a trove of revealing documents fell into her lap, plunging her behind the scenes in an especially controversial case. Drawing on investigative reporting, cultural analysis, and her own experiences, Kipnis demonstrates the chilling effect of this new sexual McCarthyism on intellectual freedom. And in the way of providing further context, I want to offer just two more quotations, Laura, from your own writing. One quotation from the book and one from the essay, My Title IX Inquisition. First, from the book, and I quote, this is Laura writing now, "The culture of sexual paranoia isn't confined to the sexual sphere. It's fundamentally altering the intellectual climate in higher education as a whole, to the point where ideas are construed as threats. Writing an essay became creating a chilling environment, according to my accusers," I'm quoting her now, "and freedoms most of us used to take for granted are being whittled away or disappearing altogether. Sexual paranoia has converted the Title IX bureaucracy into an insatiable behemoth, bloated by its own federal power grab, though protests are few because what are you in favor of rape culture or something? In other words, there aren't protests because of the fear that that will be the response." Continuing the quotation, "Also, paranoia is a formula for intellectual rigidity, and its inroads on campus are so effectively dumbing down the place that the traditional ideal of the university as a refuge for complexity, a setting for the free exchange of ideas, is getting buried under an avalanche of platitudes and fear." End of quotation. And then finally from the essay, My Title IX Inquisition, and I quote, "The reality is that the more colleges devote themselves to creating safe spaces, that new watchword for students, the more dangerous those campuses become for professors." Laura, these are pretty serious indictments of the academy. Help us understand them. How did your experience lead you to such conclusions? How did you get to the place exactly of writing the book? And where are you now on these matters since the book's publication and the larger cultural reaction?
Those are a lot of questions. So I fell into all of this by accident. I was destined to fall into this because I'm somebody who has written, I guess, in a sort of contrarian way about sexual politics. And just to give you a little backstory, so I was asked to write this essay about campus sexual politics for the Chronicle of Higher Education, which I don't know if any of you read this, but I was not under the impression any students actually read the Chronicle of Higher Education. So I wrote this sort of freewheeling essay about things that were happening on our campus at the time, which were trigger warnings and a kind of heightening climate of sexual paranoia. And, the next thing I knew, there was this protest march, and students were carrying this, mattress and pillows and saying that I was supporting rape culture, and then I was brought up on Title IX complaints. So this was all quite surprising to me that you could write an essay, and I do write in a sort of ironic tone, and have students think that they can wield this power of this federal mandate to try to silence a professor from writing an essay, in a national publication. So that was indicative of the kind of overreach that was going on. And then I found out from the inside what the process is like, because it was all, very mysterious. As somebody who's accused of something, even though I hadn't technically assaulted anyone, I mean, it's this very kind of intimidating process. You're not really told what the evidence is. You're not told at the beginning who charged you with what. And so, I was on the inside of this thing that's actually always behind closed doors. So the minute that I got this notice from the Title IX officer saying you've been brought up in Title IX complaints, I mean, at first I was like, it's like getting the, notice from the IRS, you're being audited or something. And then the next thing I thought is, what an amazing story has just sort of fallen in my lap. And I think the presumption of the people who accused me was that I would keep quiet about this, and that, they could silence me with this tactic. And I just thought, but wait, I'm a writer. And, no, you can't actually tell me what I can and can't say. So it did make me feel even a little more feisty than I usually do, because I did feel like I was encountering something that needed to be pushed back against. And it was just a very interesting experience to go through, because, I mean, I actually am not somebody who really enjoys confrontation, but I found this side of myself that, wants to stand up for principles and wants to, as I found out more and more about other people who've been accused of various kinds of violations, after I went public with the charges against me, I felt like I had a lot of information that I just really wanted to not sit on. So that's a bit of a lead up.
And the principles you were fighting for exactly were what?
Well, first of all, I mean, free speech in a kind of old-fashioned way. I mean, and it's not something I had ever thought about. I learned about the Constitution and principles about, democracy back when I was in grade school, and it's something I always took for granted. So it never occurred to me that, through some sort of mechanism like this, somebody who is just a writer writing her opinions about stuff, that somebody would try to quash that. And I mean, it's a complicated thing, because I'm actually at a private university, and there's a sort of distinction about whether First Amendment applies to private employment versus if I was working at, say, a state school, where it would actually be covered by constitutional guarantees. So that all gets a bit complicated. But part of what I realized was that, as I started hearing what the charges against me were, and there were all sorts of restrictions on what I could be told and when I would be told it, and I realized that the process was actually designed to sort of sandbag people, because they wanted to wait and tell me what the charges against me were while I was in a meeting with the investigators, and then have me answer questions about them. So, I mean, the process is actually designed, I think, to find people guilty and to put them in a disadvantage about the process. So that was, as I started to get some hints about what this whole thing was about, because when I was brought up in these charges, I had very little idea what Title IX was. So the whole thing was kind of a learning process. But I am, somebody who, like, my background is I went to art school. I started as a painter. I'm interested in things like imagination and creative freedom, and being able to push back against the moment, the social moment, against what you see as the strictures of the moment, and also like how much your employer can dictate about what you get to say and not say in your off time. So all of these things seem like encroachments to me, and also not just something that was happening on my own campus. I mean, as I learned, later, there were things that were happening all over the country.
All right. So freedom of speech, academic freedom,
those things,
freedom for creativity.
And
these
imagination.
Are the kinds, and imagination. These are the kinds of principles you thought were at stake. And at various places in the book and in your writing, you associate these principles not only with, say, constitutional democracy, the Declaration of Independence, and that sort of thing, but also a kind of feminism which is deep and close to your heart. And you've contrasted your feminist vision with what you see as another kind of feminist vision out there, which I think you were inclined to see as a kind of faux feminism, I hope I'm not reading too much into it. Can you say a little bit about this debate among feminists about the sort of experience that you had?
Yeah. I just go back to the thing about imagination. I mean, one thing I would also like to add is that I think as a writer or somebody, working with ideas, you also want the freedom to be wrong about things, to talk about ideas in public, to venture, ideas, to have conversations and, have debates about things. And I felt like that also was being closed down. I mean, in terms of feminism, I came of age at a different time. I came of age when sexual liberation, sexual freedom, and feminism had a certain kind of affinity for one another. And also, at the time, I guess I was sort of very influenced by the feminist anti-porn movement because I was against the feminist anti-pornography movement. Andrew Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, and the sort of offshoots of their way of thinking. And Ed mentioned wrote a book about pornography called Bound and Gagged, where I was kind of interested in developing other sort of arguments about pornography, including all the class politics or the class issues in pornography. So it's not just about sex. I think there are also other kinds of issues and forms of expression being worked out in pornography that the anti-porn movement, I thought, was ignoring. So I was kind of trying to make it a more complex issue than just women were being affronted by porn or that porn led in some monkey see, monkey do kind of way to sexual assault. So, I actually think that the feminist anti-porn movement, and Andrew Dworkin in particular, is very much still alive at this moment behind the scenes. She's dead, but behind the scenes is a kind of very much an intellectual influence on campus politics at the moment. So I suppose one of the things that interests me and always did interest me about feminism was the idea of expanding freedom. Expanding freedom for women, whether that meant sexual freedom, mobility, employment, career aspirations, imagination, all forms of freedom. And, I came of age when feminism styled itself or thought of itself as an emancipation movement. And as somebody on the left, I thought of, and I think of myself as a left-wing feminist, that vision of freedom and emancipation could sort of be articulated in relation to other forms of freedom and liberation, like redistribution of resources. So I wanted to see a kind of feminism that wasn't a narrow single issue thing about women getting to be CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. That wasn't the brand of feminism that interested me, but a left-wing emancipatory feminism. So, as I see the development of American feminism, I say American mainstream feminism, because there are a lot of different branches and offshoots. There's campus feminism is quite a different thing from mainstream feminism. But that focus on emancipation and freedom has been lost, and the focus has become on, the kinds of restrictions of freedom and focuses on, I guess, injury, including sexual injury, to the exclusion of discussing other forms of possibility for women. So I see that as kind of unfortunate, and having gotten caught up in this campus version of a sort of new way of restricting, like what a woman could say, in an essay. So I'm losing I'm losing the train of like a bunch of different, this is a complicated question, and I'm trying to develop a bunch of different strands of the moment and the history leading up to this moment.
Yeah, there's a new kind of, I think we're there. There's in some moments you say that there is this distinctive kind of feminism operative today, reflected in, say, the mores governing the way Title IX is being adjudicated and this kind of thing, certain attitudes toward women, which in certain moments you say represent a kind of throwback to a kind of conservative time, but like a kind of a conservative vision of women as vulnerable, passive, lacking a certain kind of agency and that sort of thing, which you, at least in certain moments in your writing, you seem to distinguish from the kind of feminism that you have always associated with an emphasis on liberation and an emphasis on agency and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I used the term feminist paternalism at one point, and one of the things that's striking about the campus situation, and particularly in relation to Title IX, is you got activists thinking of themselves as feminists or thinking of themselves as on the left, who are actually like relying on these bureaucratic structures, these, Title IX offices, campus administrators to kind of adjudicate their sex lives. And certainly, there's nothing in anything that I'm saying that means that I don't think sexual assault is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. There needs to be education about it. There needs to be franker discussions about what actually people are doing on the weekends and that sort of thing. And sexual assaulters need to be, there certainly needs to be structures in place to deal with sexual assault. But one of the things that I've seen is that the definition of sexual assault has become bigger and bigger and bigger and expanding and expanding and expanding, so that things that were once kind of an annoyance are now seen as somehow worthy of going through a whole administrative process. So that's a real change, and it's something that I don't think is necessarily or particularly in women's interests. So I do think that there's been a kind of loss of a sense of agency on the part of women and younger women, and a kind of turning over of those functions to campus administrators. And at the same time, there's been this expansion, and this is where I think there's a politics of this that gets not spoken of a lot. There's an expansion of the bureaucracy and the administrator level on campuses. If you kind of read some of the figures, and I talk about this in the book, there's a really interesting book called The Fall of the Faculty, about where the dollars on campuses are being spent now. And they're not going toward educational resources. They're not going toward libraries, toward faculty, but they're going toward administrators. So like in the last 10 years, and part of this has to do with the growth of the requirements for reporting that Title IX, the Obama era governance put in place, there's been this immense growth of the bureaucracy and the administrative level on campus. And the more that this administrative level grows, I think that universities have actually lost their direction as places that are devoted to education and devoted to ideas. And so something else is happening. So I felt like part of the reason I got brought up on Title IX complaints was exactly getting caught at that sort of juncture or intersection where administrators are willing to step in and tell a professor, tenured, been teaching many, many years, what she can publish in an essay. So these forces are colliding, and part of it has to do with distribution of resources on campuses. And I think loss of an educational function and the growth of what you could call a carceral function, like a policing function, that universities are devoting themselves to policing as opposed to education. It's a bit of a broad statement, but yeah.
Just to sort of bring the conversation to something very specific, and to go back to one of the quotations that I drew from your writing, when you make that claim about the creation of safe spaces, the more safe spaces that are created, the more danger is posed to professors. What does that mean exactly?
Well, there's the rise of accusation. I mean, because of having written about this, I get this amazing amount of communication from accused professors and accused students, but largely accused professors around the country. And the kinds of things that professors are getting accused of is kind of amazing. I mean, anything from, making a joke that somebody doesn't like in class to getting reported, and this happens over and over, for somebody thinking the professor has made weird eye contact, to, just this level of reporting and accusation that's going on. And because of the growth of this bureaucratic structure, some of it within Title IX offices or human resources, the offices have different kinds of names, those administrators are, I think, really taking over and changing the culture of the place. So professors are very frequently afraid to teach materials that they used to teach that might offend students, difficult material. I mean, even law professors at Ivy League places are saying that they get protests from students about teaching rape law, because there's sort of a rise of a culture of sensitivity and injury to the point that students are far more willing to lodge complaints about stuff like that, and professors are fearful of their jobs. I mean, people are afraid of losing their salaries, their mortgages, their health insurance, and that's happening more and more and more. Even at art schools, there was a case of a guy at the Chicago Art Institute who was teaching a class on comic book history, and which has oftentimes a kind of problematic history of racist and sexist kind of speech, and students objected to hearing the material that he was teaching in his class, lodged complaints. This guy got his teaching cut, lost his health insurance. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about the more that students feel empowered to, and feel offended enough and then empowered to complain about professors are literally at risk. It's not a sense of being at risk, but literally at risk of losing their positions.
Thinking about this set of issues from the perspective of left, right, conservative, progressive, those kinds of matters, it's interesting to note that there's a kind of complexity in assessing you and what you stand for with respect to these issues vis-a-vis these political classifications. So, for example, as I've already mentioned, you've said that the new feminism, which you have some worries about, represents a kind of hearkening back to an earlier time, a kind of conservatism, a conservative view of women as vulnerable as opposed to agency and so forth. So in that respect, conservatism might get associated with the position that you are offering criticism of. But on the other hand, in certain moments, you are seen as a kind of heroine of the right. I know that doesn't sit with you because you are sort of deep down a lefty, but as a matter of fact, that has been the case, and that the right has seen you, some conservative movements have seen you in advocating free speech and a kind of freedom and challenging the orthodoxy of the academic left, that kind of thing. Do you have any responses to that set of considerations?
Well, it's very confusing to me, and I mean, I've really spent a lot of time trying to figure this out. Partly because of fear of, I was mentioning certain people I don't want to end up, being at conferences with or on a stage with.
On the right, that is.
People on the right, yeah. I think that to divide campus politics into left-right, contingents makes less and less sense at this moment because, I think there is a rise of authoritarianism on the campus left, and having got caught in the middle of this free speech issue, it's the right that seems to be, and this is the weird, surprising thing, the right that seems to be, or conservatives, let's say, maybe more traditional conservatives, standing up for, perhaps because they have a certain affinity for the Constitution and for democratic values, but it seems to be people who are right-leaning who are standing up for what used to be thought of as democratic American values, like free speech, like due process. And, due process is something that I kind of alluded to as I've learned a lot about the lack of due process in the Title IX sphere and in Title IX complaints. So it is a politically confusing time. And I think that there aren't a lot of people on the left standing up for free speech, and then when you do, you're labeled, a conservative or a friend of conservatives. So it's
There is a tradition. There is a tradition of deep down lefties expressing in various moments problems with the left or criticisms of the left. And the one that comes to mind for me is George Orwell, who was, again, deep down a kind of socialist and never abandoned deep commitments to socialist principles. But when he went to fight in the Spanish Civil War and he saw the way the Stalinists were operating with a certain kind of authoritarianism and orthodoxy, he was insisting in reaction on the importance of a certain kind of freedom and so forth. And so there is this to save you from the conservative ranks, as I know you want to be saved from the conservative ranks, there is this tradition of lefties being concerned about certain tendencies, authoritarian or totalitarian tendencies
Well, there's the
in the left.
anti-Stalinist left in the 30s. And,
Right.
I've kind of was making a little joke to myself as being, thinking of myself as part of the anti-Stalinist left of this moment.
Right.
So, and people like Mary McCarthy, who was a sort of hero of mine, became a pro-Trotskyite because she mistakenly signed a petition where somebody said, "Do you think Trotsky should get a fair trial at a party?" And she said, "Sure." And so she found her name on a petition and ended up, being part of the anti-Stalinist left for saying Trotsky should have a fair trial.
Right.
So it does seem to me like there's, there needs to be on campus something akin to the anti-Stalinist left.
Okay, interesting. I'm wondering if at this point we could expand the conversation somewhat to matters of sexual politics in the larger culture, that is, say, beyond the academy. And I'm thinking particularly of the Me Too movement, which emerged after the publication of your book, although you have written on the Me Too movement since the publication of your book. And I think as a way of getting us going, I'd like to start with a controversy in which you eventually did become involved. Maybe you could say something about the details here. The controversy revolving around Gian Ghomeshi, who was the Canadian broadcaster who was accused of sexual assault and so forth, and then Ian Baruma, who was the editor of New York Review of Books, and you wrote for New York Review of Books, and all of this swirling around Me Too and so forth. So could you say something about the details of what happened there, how you got involved, what was Ian Baruma's role and so forth? Yeah.
Well, Ian, who took over as the new editor of the New York Review of Books, had asked me to come on and write a review. My first review for them was Gretchen Carlson wrote a book called, I think it's called Be Fierce. I think that's the title. And it's about workplace sexual harassment. And she was one who was harassed by Roger Ailes, and she got a huge settlement, which she can't talk about. So she wrote this book about sexual harassment in the workplace. And so that was the first book that Ian asked me to review. And it was actually a kind of almost radicalizing thing. This was right after the allegations against Harvey Weinstein had come out. So this is about a year, well, it was a year ago, like November or December. And I had some issues with the book, but I'm somebody, because I've been cloistered in academia, I've never worked in an office. And the kind of stuff that she was talking about that goes on in offices and the sort of harassment and the retaliation, there was something really affecting and radicalizing to me about Gretchen Carlson's book. And one of the things that I realized, and I was trying to write about at the time all the men that were falling, the powerful men, editors, people, it was largely at that time people in media. And one of the things I realized, I had to make a sort of distinction for myself about and there were a lot of people who were left liberals who thought Al Franken, had been badly, mistreated. And one of the things I realized reading Gretchen's book is that for me, the dividing line between permissible and impermissible was that you cannot touch people, you being a boss or you being a male coworker, cannot touch people in the workplace. Like that's, the line. So there was an incident in the book where Gretchen talks about when she was young and on a job, and she's riding in the car with a cameraman, and he starts making these kind of like suggestive remarks to her. And she says, my heart was pounding so fast, I thought I was going to die. I thought about jumping out of the car. I was panicking. And I raised these questions about, well, okay, the guy was, first of all, he wasn't her boss. He was actually below her in the pecking order. Okay, he said some gross stuff to her. But what is it about women's responses to sexual harassment in a situation where there's no real overt or obvious danger that she should be so panicked in this moment? And I had written a book earlier about femininity called The Female Thing, and I was really interested in women's, the acculturation, the socialization of women into vulnerability in ways that I think it impedes us in the world. And so I tried to write about that in relation to this incident that Carlson was describing. And that was the younger staff on the New York Review of Books very much objected to me saying, how come Gretchen didn't just tell him to shut the up and instead, thought about jumping out of a moving car? Shouldn't we be able to analyze that moment and say, are there other responses she could have had than jumping out of a car? So this was the beginning of what happened to Ian at the New York Review of Books. And I don't want to take...
Ian is the editor.
Sorry,
of the
Ian
New
was
Yorker.
the editor who got fired because his younger staff rebelled against him. And I don't want to say that I was the cause of him getting fired or take like that much credit for it, but I think it started... So Ian told me at that moment, you will make my job a lot easier if you change this thing you wrote and add, but she was young, and of course she had reason to be threatened. So that's where this dividing line opened up. So when Ian Baruma later decided to publish in the New York Review of Books sorry, just to go back, I mentioned Al Franken. One of the things I realized was that if Franken was guilty of the things he was charged of, which was like groping women during photo shoots, yes, I think that he should have resigned. So that's my dividing line. You cannot touch. Okay, make a dirty joke, whatever. Speech is a different thing than touching. So that's personally where I decided that's where, I think this movement needs to be, and that, speech is different than action. Anyway, so Ian Baruma decided to publish an account by an accused man who had been put on trial in Canada, and
This is Gian Ghomeshi. Right?
Yeah, Gian Ghomeshi was a very prominent BBC radio host, and to talk about, Ian as an editor wanted Ghomeshi to talk about what it was like to have been at the top of your profession and then fall. Have your career, lose everything, lose your career. And Ghomeshi had not been found guilty of anything. I think there was one case where there had been a settlement. Anyway, there was a big ruckus after this piece was published. Ian gave a radio interview where he said some stuff that people took, I think, the wrong way, and he lost his job. Is that?
Yeah, and so he lost his job, and you responded to that loss with an article in print with the New York Times, raising some questions about whether or not he should have moved away, should have been forced to leave his position because he published the Ghomeshi article. And then you were also a signatory, as I'm recalling, on a list of, among a number of New York Review of Books contributors, saying that he should not have been fired as editor, or however that
Along with
went.
about 100 other people. So this was one of those moments where I guess I found myself in these positions where you have to decide, am I going to sort of stick my neck out and say what I think, or am I going to play it safe? So I kind of figured if I wrote that piece for the Times, it was an op-ed, I would probably not end up writing again for the New York Review of Books because I would be blacklisted there. So, that was the question. Should I pipe down? Should I, write the piece? What I was trying to say in the piece was that I think that this was actually a quite big moment in the culture, the firing of Baruma, because no editor in the country will take another chance on publishing a piece where he or she takes a risk again, because they will be afraid of losing their jobs. So at that moment, something shifted irrevocably in the culture where we're going to end up with a tamer, safer, perhaps less offensive, but also perhaps less intellectually engaging culture because of the publisher's decision. And I think it was a bit kowtowing to the staff, and the staff of people who wanted me to say that Gretchen Carlson, of course she had right to be concerned when the guy said to her in the car. So there was like a cultural rift opening at that publication that was generational, that was to some degree gendered, not entirely, that my piece was part of, and then Baruma's decision to publish this Ghomeshi article, and there was a lot of criticism of his editorial decisions because he didn't say enough in this article what Ghomeshi had been accused of. And he'd been accused of some crappy, of violence, perhaps within sadomasochistic kinds of sexual encounters, perhaps not, but he'd been accused of violence to women.
Choking a woman.
Choking.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. The question becomes to what degree that was consensual, because as perhaps some people know, sometimes that kind of stuff is part of rough sex.
Right. Your objection was to Baruma's being forced to resign. Do you think that he made a mistake in publishing the Ghomeshi piece?
I was educated to believe. I mean, I didn't think so at the beginning, but when I read the pushback against the piece, and I had only vaguely remembered the charges against Ghomeshi, I think, yes, look, it's the job of an editor to be attuned to the times. And there was a big misstep on his part to not realize that he should have included the information about what Ghomeshi had been accused of. And Baruma's position was, I want to know what it's like, for this guy to lose everything. And everybody else's position was, yeah, but you gave him this platform and let him say all this stuff without telling, the world what he was accused of. So I think editors and writers that I know have said Baruma did misstep. Should he have been fired for that misstep? Should he lose his career? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, all right. So he made a you think he made a mistake in the substantive judgment, but he should not have lost his position.
I think he made a mistake, and the culture of outrage is such at this moment that one mistake and you're out. So, I mean, for the people on the outrage side of that, I mean, let's hope you don't make that one misstep and lose your jobs and your health insurance and, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I wonder if I could just, at risk perhaps on my part, push you on the Ghomeshi piece a bit. I've actually had a look at the piece, but I read the piece for the first time knowing what the objections were to the piece and so forth. It is a rather interesting piece in light of the larger circumstances. That is to say, you can say to yourself as you're reading the piece, here's the point where he's trying to justify or excuse what he did, and you can see a form of manipulation here. There are moments of confession and repentance and so forth. Sometimes it seems authentic, other times it just seems like baloney. So one might say that something was learned, it can be learned from having read the piece. Again, knowing the proper context. Not knowing the context, I'm conceding that point, you would miss quite a bit in the history of the situation. Do you just think that's a mistaken way of thinking about the piece? Or since you think it was a mistake for him to have published it? Because what you're saying is that given the climate, he should have been sensitive to the climate, and the climate ought to have dictated the judgment in some sense. And that kind of intention a little bit with some other things you say in other places about people should be able to say what they want, no matter how offensive,
so,
and that kind of thing.
I'm less comfortable in the realm of shoulds and oughts. And as somebody think of myself as a cultural critic, I'm more happy in the realm of, well, what's the most complex thing we could say about this? And I actually think one of the most complex things we could say about this is that Ghomeshi was a manipulator and also manipulated Ian Baruma. And Baruma, for perhaps whatever blind spots of his own, allowed himself to be manipulated. And a piece ran that created a ruckus that perhaps somebody with, better social acuity could have seen coming. So was Baruma blind to some of the gender politics of this? Perhaps. Was Ghomeshi an incredibly, I'm fascinated that all the stuff that Ghomeshi was accused of, he sort of managed to reenact in his relations with the editor of the New York Review of Books. So, there was certainly a certain kind of sadomasochistic, I can't, that goes too far. Perhaps there was, to phrase it, to be more rhetorically skillful. But, so that's interesting to me, that Ian Baruma himself was brought down at the hands of this guy who himself was brought down by, these charges against him. So you see, but this is the moment that we're in. And, writing about these things and speaking about them, I'm sometimes aware you have to wend, is that a word? Very carefully. Wind, trek, I'm not quite sure the right word. Step very carefully around these things because you're we all have these blind spots. And as I say, I think I wrote a book about scandal, and it's all about how is it that people manage to bring themselves down without sort of seeing it in front of them. And, in retrospect, we can certainly see that Ian Baruma should have seen this big gaping pothole in front of him. So was that some sort of self-destructive, side of him? I don't know, but those are, to me, some of the interesting questions. But this moment is so rife it presents so many opportunities for downfall and self-destruction and ruination. And, we haven't mentioned social media becoming, the target of social media shaming for, something inadvertent that you said. And one of the things that happened to Baruma was that he gave this interview to Isaac Chotiner at Slate. And Chotiner, I've been interviewed by, was kind of a bulldog, pushed him up against the wall, and I think Ian misspoke, where he said, "That's not my concern," when Chotiner asked him about the allegations against Ghomeshi. And he should have said, he meant to say, "My concern was this other set of questions in the piece," but it sounded like he was saying, "I'm unconcerned." And so Chotiner went on and is now working at The New Yorker. Chotiner, by bringing down Baruma, got a promotion and is the podcast guy on the NewYorker.com. So people profit in this era by bringing other people down, and that's something to be aware of if you're going to venture into public.
Yeah, thanks. We're about the time now where we're going to move to general Q&A. And so what we would like to do is to invite people who are interested in putting a question to Laura to raise their hand and to please then speak into a microphone. As people are thinking about formulating their questions, I just want to throw one other question at you. Just an association thing. Kavanaugh hearings, Christine Blasey Ford.
I was in an uncomfortable position there because obviously I wanted Kavanaugh to go down. I did not want Kavanaugh to be confirmed. I'm against everything that he stands for. At the same time, because I've, in the campus context and in terms of accusations, I'm somewhat against old memories being relied on, things that happened to somebody years ago being the basis of an accusation. I actually do think memory is not completely reliable. I know that my own isn't. I'll just briefly say I wrote a piece in The Guardian where I talked about my own, like a little not very serious Me Too moment of somebody groping me years ago. In an English guy who turned out to then become a member of parliament. He was just a journalist when I knew him. And I wrote this thing, and I thought it was kind of funny. But also not, because the guy groped me, and he was like walking behind me out of nowhere. This was many, many, many years ago. And I published this, and it would be sort of known in Britain who he was. I didn't name him. So the friend who was with me at that time was kind of, didn't exactly reprimand me, but he said it didn't happen like that. Because I had told him at the time, this was probably 25 years ago, what had happened. I had remembered that it was in London. It turned out, no, it was in New York. I had remembered that it was the first time I met this guy, the groper guy. No, it turned out it was the second. So, the fact that, I remembered what happened, but I didn't remember or falsely remembered all of the details. And I certainly remembered, I felt like I had a very clear memory of it. So to be consistent on the Kavanaugh thing, I would have to say, I don't think that Christina Ford's allegations were probative. I think that, if 5 other people had come forward and said the same thing, maybe, but one accuser from 30 years ago, I don't think that's probative, but I also will say I think Kavanaugh never should have been confirmed because he showed what he was made of at the hearings. So.
Thank you. Questions? Just raise your hand, please, and then you'll get a mic.
Hi, thank you for coming and for sharing your thoughts. One question that I had was regarding kind of, you talked, and correct me if I mischaracterized what you said, but you kind of talked about the distinct separation between comments and actions in terms of categorizing things as something that people should be worried about or sexually aggressive. And one particular instance from this summer that happened to me when I was interning in Minneapolis, I was on a bus in Minneapolis, and like, not to bring personal experiences at the forefront, but this is just something that came to mind. Was I was on a bus, 3 men walked on, and around me started talking to each other and said, "I just want to take her off the bus and rape her." And so in that moment, obviously, even though that was just a comment, it was something that I physically feared at that particular moment. And so I think I just want to know, I want you to expand more on that point that you talked about, because you seemed to kind of portray a very distinct separation between those two things, but I don't think that's necessarily always the case. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts more on that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, it's certainly the case that something like that would feel threatening. Part of what I think that needs to happen is that, women particularly, but everybody who feels at risk needs to be better educated in how to deal with situations like that. I talk about in the book that when I was in my 20s, I took self-defense classes, like, where you learn to kick through a board and that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that you would want to deploy self-defense tactics in that sort of situation, but I think one of the reasons I think women feel more vulnerable in public situations is because we actually do feel more like we can be physically aggressed on. And I think one of the benefits of feeling like you can defend yourself is just a different kind of confidence in the world. So, I suppose my own interest is in how can women, myself included, expand the sense of freedom that we feel and mobility that we feel in the world. And if any who gets on a bus, and says any like that can make us feel cowering and intimidated and like we don't belong in that place, our freedom is limited, emotionally and probably in terms of where we'll go and what we'll do. So the world is, it's not like a perfect place. I'm not sure that all forms of male sexual aggression are ever going to be completely contained. I would like them to be. I would certainly like there to be forms of collective action that contain male sexual aggression of that sort. Until that day happens, what can we do in the meantime? So that's the question. I kind of talk about that in the book. But I take your point that the distinction between actions and speech can feel more, less separate.
So my question is about how you said there's increasing bureaucracy on campus in terms of Title IX and just administration in general. And so I'm asking if it seems like in most situations that you've encountered, it's been with students accusing professors and then using like the administration, the Title IX, against faculty. And I guess it could be bad that the administration is becoming more bureaucratic in general, but in the terms, like, it's basically seems like it's working for students, which is sort of empowering for students. So I think, what is the balance between faculty and students in terms of power, or for students to decide their educations, or for them to like speak out against harassment and things like that? Like, is there a limit to what students should be able to do against faculty? And is it also possible that the administration might or has already grown so much that it doesn't necessarily work for either students or faculty in that sense? If it's already like gotten too big to like do anything meaningful, like with all the Title IX sort of regulations that go on?
Well, to take up the question of student situations, I think you were saying you think or proposing that that's working in favor of students. So part of what I got interested in was the other side, the accused student, and whether those processes are working for the accused. part of the problem with these administrators is that who are handling those sorts of cases is they don't actually have like fact-finding capabilities. They don't have subpoena power. They don't have, so they're guessing most of the time on oftentimes very incomplete evidence. And what I found in talking to people who had been accused, both professors and students, oftentimes there's a kind of bias against the accused. So the process is working perhaps more for people who make accusations, but who oftentimes don't feel the process is working for them either. But I think it's working far less of the time for people who are accused of things. And one of the indications of that is when you start reading about the lawsuits that are coming down through the court system, and you read about the kinds of summary judgments that are made, because most of these situations are, in which there's an accusation made, are situations where two people have been drinking. And what I found is that there's a huge amount of gender bias, so that if two people have been drinking, it's always going to be the man's responsibility. So these are heterosexual situations. And regardless of what he says, or regardless of what the woman, did, or regardless of what was or wasn't said. So there's a kind of rush to judgment. So part of the problem is that the universities, colleges and universities are just not equipped to make the kinds of decisions that they're in the position, or were in the position of having to make under the Obama guidelines. So that's a bit of a long answer to, they're doing something that they don't have the tools or the capability in many cases of doing. And it's also being done in secret. That's the other thing that I talk about in the book. It's all behind closed doors, so there's no review until these cases hit the courts. And in oftentimes when these cases hit the civil courts, because a student who has parents with enough money to bring a lawsuit, which is very expensive, so only rich kids can bring the lawsuits. When those cases hit the courts, the judges are saying, are you kidding? Looking at the kinds of rulings that are being made in these cases and saying there's, nothing procedural here, it's biased, it defies logic. So those are the kinds of rulings that are starting to be revealed to the public in the civil cases.
Other questions? Someone?
I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about this issue of cultural sensitivity and injury as it intersects in academia with social media expectations of adjudication.
Well, there's so many sides of that. Do you mean like situations where somebody posts something in social media and then the university gets on their
Well,
on them?
that, or in a general context where the social media dialogue begins to run ahead of the fact-finding and other sorts of things. And so can you comment about the role of social media as it plays into this new culture of sensitivity and injury?
Well, that's huge. That's a huge question. I mean, there's the rush to judgment on social media. There's the joke taken out of context sort of thing. And then there's the shaming machinery that goes into effect. And then you've got universities, colleges and universities, trying to protect their brand, I guess. Like say when there's a professor involved who makes a joke about, like the guy who said, all I want for Christmas is white genocide, and got fired from, I think it was Drexel, for saying that, where he was using the term in the way that, the opposite of what it sounded like he meant. I mean, he was sort of indicting white supremacists by using their own terminology, and it was taken completely out of context. So you've got just, all sorts of, situations like that are exacerbated by the social media rush to judgment. I'm not sure if that in any way addresses what you're asking about.
I had a follow-up to an answer to a question that you had earlier. And you had talked about, women becoming more comfortable with defending themselves, becoming more assertive, learning about how to deal with certain situations. At what point do you say that we need to shift the responsibility off of women for men's actions? And at what point do we need to start educating men about what to do better and how to stop mistreating the women around them?
At every point. I mean, from day one. But it's not an either or. The focus, I think, of activists has been on, kind of what you're saying. The responsibility is on men. Men have to change. One of the things that I was trying to address in the book was decisions that women are also making in these situations that are not always in their own best interests. So I just would say to you, I don't think it's an either or. Yes, male sexuality has to be reformed, but until that time, I mean, I don't think we can sit around and wait for that to happen, because what if it doesn't? So I do think in the meantime, women also, I think, need to act assertively, protectively, with agency, with savvy, and with self-knowledge, because, I think that a lot of the situations that women are finding themselves in, by which I mean like passed out drunk on a, bathroom floor somewhere, are not, in their best interests. So both things are true.
So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
My question is, with regards to sort of the new culture that's evolving of victimhood that you talk about, also students feeling more empowered to make a lot more of these accusations. Do you think that the problem is with students making a lot more of these accusations, or with the system of vetting those accusations? Because I feel like the alternative to that is we don't students or people who feel abused don't report those incidences as much. For instance, I remember earlier in the year on St. Olaf Senate, we had the Title IX officers come over and give a talk, and they said that with the St. Olaf numbers being higher than you would expect for our college, the problem is not that our college has too many people reporting, but you have the bigger colleges where students don't feel empowered or feel in a place to make reports, and so their numbers appear less than what you would expect. So I feel like in general, on the world stage, what you have is less victims than actually exist. Most victims are not reporting cases. So do you think that the culture needs to change where people don't report as much, or there needs to be a different system of vetting the accusations?
It's a difficult question to answer in the way that you framed it, because we don't know exactly what we're talking about. Like, what kind of accusations are we talking about? So if we're talking about sexual assault, that's a different thing than if we're talking about somebody feeling offended in a classroom. So should there be more instances of people reporting feeling offended in a classroom by like a professor's, like some dumb joke? No, I don't think there should be more of that. And I also do think there's not a good system for vetting that kind of thing. And one of the reasons, and this goes back to the kind of context, the economic context, is there is an increasing sense on the part of most colleges and universities that the students are consumers. And consumer satisfaction, is part of, they want the students to have a, good customer experience, let's say. And that conditions how these things get dealt with. So these adjudications are not exactly happening in some kind of contextless situation. They're sort of like in the context of these very large businesses in which students are a part of that. So that's one aspect. So I can't say, do I want there to be less or more accusations? I mean, I want there to be the right kind of vetting of serious enough accusations that something certainly, that something needs to be addressed. So I think we would need to talk in more specifics, I think, in order to get a better answer than that. Does that make sense? Or not? More or less, okay.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have a question specifically on your thoughts of locker room talk as free speech, specifically the president's remarks on women as sexual objects. And so I'd like to know if you would endorse locker room talk as free speech, even though it perpetuates a culture, rape culture, that puts women at risk.
So I wrote a review recently in The Atlantic of Rebecca Traister's book about women's anger, and I actually talk exactly about this. I think the subtitle is something like The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. And one of the things I say is that what I'm far more angry about at this moment than Trump's remarks about pussy grabbing is, like, I'm angry about the thing that Traister doesn't talk about in the book, which is income redistribution. What she doesn't talk about are, like, economic issues affecting all women, like having to do with things like childcare, subsidized childcare, abortion rights, subsidized abortion or free birth control. So these are issues that affect all women. So the question becomes, why are we focusing on Donald Trump's locker room talk and not focusing on these bottom line economic issues that affect all women? So I think it's about priorities. In the best of all possible worlds, I would like there to be no locker room talk. I would like men to speak respectfully about women. But in the best of all possible worlds, I would like, the 1% that's, got the, like, whatever percent of the gross national product being directed to them to give some of it back. So how come in this, like, long book about women's anger and inveighing against Trump and locker room talk, there's not room to articulate that sort of issue, being offended at stupid stuff guys say about women's bodies? How come we're not connecting, and this goes back to the Me Too issue, why can we not connect those sorts of experiences with larger issues that affect all women? So that's where my politics are. Like, I don't think offense at smutty sex talk is a politics. And I think that we've gotten so diverted by focusing on stuff that, just makes us feel icky. I don't like listening to Trump say that stuff, but, I like even less the impoverishment of vast swaths of the population.
If I could just enter in on this, because I heard in the question a connection drawn between Trump's language, his discourse, and the support of rape culture, if I've heard that correctly. What would you say about that? You're saying that there's something trivial about locker room talk or what ways Trump's talking, and there are deeper issues, more important issues for women, socioeconomic issues. But I heard in part the question saying that there's a connection between a certain kind of public discourse and rape culture, and that maybe your response sort of sidesteps that somewhat. What would you say?
I think one thing I'd say is that I'm not a great fan of the term rape culture, partly because, and this goes back to what I was talking about with this person, I think it's not specific enough. I think it's a feel-good term. It's a slogan that doesn't actually get at what is really happening on campus. One of the things that, bless you, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was writing this book was, these statistics that come down that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women on campus are sexually assaulted or raped. Sometimes it's blurred. And I started looking around my own classrooms and thinking, are 20% of my students being sexually assaulted? And I started talking to my students. I wanted to find out from them, well, what are you actually experiencing? So I spent a year having conversations with my students about what actually was happening. And I started getting much more textured pictures about what their social life was like, what the weekend parties are like, what the drinking was like. And it's a lot more complicated than the slogan rape culture. So I think to throw that term around doesn't do anything to address the actual substance of what happens in people's lives and how we can be smarter about that. And as educators, how we can educate students to make better decisions, to have more respect for each other, to not do dumb stuff and end up in, situations you'll later regret. So, there's a lot of complexity that rape culture, that term, elides.
Further questions?
Earlier, you mentioned a bit about how bureaucracies, particularly academic bureaucracies, have a tendency to self-aggregate, become larger, and also to self-justify their expansions.
You put it better than I did, thank you.
So I was just wondering, like at least, and I'll try to keep it as pointed as possible, at least within the academic sphere, how can we avoid, to borrow a phrase, like a polar night of icy darkness, or so to speak?
I mean, I think it is the universal law of bureaucracy is that, part of their purpose is to increase their bureaucracy. I mean, I think partly more transparency. It's not the sort of thing most people spend much time thinking about. Is like where, looking at their university's budgets. But there is this really great book, I mentioned it, The Fall of the Faculty, by a guy named, his last name's Ginsberg. I think he's at Hopkins, if I remember. And he really lays it out. It's maybe 5 years old, but he talks about where the dollars are going across the country. So there are social scientists who are actually aggregating that sort of data. So perhaps that's a place to start is, the people who got those numbers.
Hi.
Hi.
I do notice that you bring up the topic of self-defense among women a lot, and I am someone who has taken several self-defense classes, so I can agree there that for certain women that might bring a certain increase in personal power, maybe that idea of personal power and ability to defend oneself. However, with that, I do have to wonder, especially in the U.S. military, since 2012, sexual assaults, the rate of sexual assault has increased near 90%, and women in the military, as reported in a 2011 study, have been found to be more likely to be raped by fellow soldiers than to be killed in combat. And so in that case, where these women do definitely know how to self-defend, what your thoughts on things like that are?
That's daunting. Is it more reporting or is it more assault? I mean, do we know?
I couldn't tell you with assault, but I do know it's an increase in reporting.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, I don't know, that's not in any way an answer, it's just a question about the numbers. I have, absolutely no idea. I mean, there's a lot of violence in the world, and some percentage of it is gendered violence. And, it's not like that makes me happy in any way to say, but I think that that's the reality. If you read somebody like Steven Pinker, he would say that the amount of violence in the world has decreased over time. I mean, he wrote this massive book like that with a lot of tables saying that. So from his standpoint, or from that standpoint, the situation has increased. I mean, I do think that there is something worth remembering for women, that not all the violence in the world is gendered violence. Because I think that, it is easy to get a kind of blinkered view that that is the condition of women. And my fear is that, like I say, that internalized sense of the world as a dangerous, perpetually dangerous, that we're perpetually at risk everywhere we go, gives us more of a sense of a sense of more limited possibilities in the world. So there's an incredible focus on sexual violence at this moment to the good, because it creates activism, it creates, the kinds of questions that you're asking, it creates forms of redress. But I also fear that there's a flip side of it that is also, to some degree, vulnerabilizing. Going back to that situation of Gretchen Carlson in the car, was she at risk of violence, or was she, her sense of fear about the potential of male sexual violence such that she was ready to jump out of the car? Was she at risk or not? I don't know. So that's all I can say. I have no good answer to that.
I think we're about the end of time. Thank you very much for your cooperation.
Thanks
and
for the
thank
great
you
questions
very much,
to the audience.
Laura, for being
Thank
with
you.
us today.
Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.